Well, respond to the criticism that they say you're the one with the vested interest, that your research is dependent upon reaching conclusions such as this, and that general canard that it's all part of a liberal cabal in which you're participating.
Right. Well, I'm always, I find it remarkable that when people make that argument, because it's just such a foreign, and to anybody who actually works in science, to anybody who's part of the culture of science, it's such a bizarre argument that makes no sense to us whatsoever, because the incentive structure in science is not to agree with the other person. You don't get papers in Nature and Science by simply saying that the other person is right. The way you make your mark in science and the way science advances is by finding something new, finding a flaw or finding some new aspect of the science that wasn't understood before. So the incentive structure is to actually to depart from the conventional wisdom, to try to advance the science in a new direction.
In other words, your future would be brighter if you could debunk climate change, or if someone else could debunk Dr. Michael Mann's thoughts on climate change, including your hockey stick.
Absolutely. There is such an incentive to that young scientist who can disprove my work or the work of other scientists that comprise our collective understanding of climate change, which, by the way, isn't a house of cards, as the critics often like to claim. It's much more like a puzzle that's just about filled in. There are a few pieces missing, but we pretty much understand what's going on, and we're filling in the details. And to that young scientist who could completely disprove our understanding of human-caused climate change and create a whole new paradigm, they would become the most celebrated scientist in the field for decades to come. And so, it just doesn't make any sense to argue that we're simply this mutual reinforcing group that's trying to toe some party line. The incentive structure in science is just the opposite of that.
Dr. Mann, on page 23 of your book, you go through the 6 stages of climate change denial.
Right.
I'd like to run through the 6 and have you give me a soundbite that you think responds to each. Maybe that's unfair to condense, but I think you can accomplish it.
No problem.
All right. So stage number 1, CO2 is not actually increasing. Michael Mann says.
Well, we have measurements around the globe that tell us that CO2 has been rising, that rise is unprecedented, in fact, in hundreds of thousands of years, potentially millions of years. And we can even look at the isotopic composition of the CO2 that's building up in the atmosphere to determine that it can't have a natural source. It's due to fossil fuel burning.
Even if it is, the increase has no impact on the climate since there is no convincing evidence of warming.
There is not only now widespread evidence from thermometer measurements around the globe, whether you look at the oceans or the land, whether you look at the southern hemisphere, the northern hemisphere, whether you look at the surface or the lower atmosphere, but we have dozens and dozens of independent lines of evidence that tell us that the globe is warming and the climate is changing in much the way we expect it to as we increase greenhouse gas concentration.
Another one that I hear often, even if it is warming, it's due to natural causes.
Yeah, well, we can actually test that. We can take the climate models that we use, we can put the natural factors in there, and guess what? If it were only natural factors that were dominating the climate, the globe should have actually cooled in recent decades rather than warmed.
Even if the warming cannot be explained by natural causes, the human impact is small, and the impact of continued greenhouse gas emissions will be minor.
Yeah, our best estimate now is that if we double CO2 concentrations from the pre-industrial levels, which we'll do in a few decades if we continue on the course that we're on, the global average temperature will change by as much as 4 degrees. The changes will be much greater in high latitudes. In the Arctic, we'll probably see a disappearance of the sea ice environment that polar bears rely upon, for example. We will see dramatic changes in the global climate system if we continue on the course that we're on.
2 more for Michael Mann. Even if the current and projected future human effects on the Earth's climate are not negligible, the changes are generally going to be good for us.
No, unfortunately, when we look at the balance of the estimated impacts of climate change, we see that for more than a couple degrees of additional warming, we would probably see a decline in global the global economy. We would see a widespread decrease in food resources, water resources. If you look across the board, the impacts are negative and increasingly negative as we see larger and larger changes.
And how about the notion that humans are very adept at adapting to change, and besides, it's too late to do anything about it, and or a technological fix is bound to come along when we really need it.
Yeah, we are making unprecedented changes in our environment, and there's simply no analog. If we look to the past, there's no evidence that either us or other living things can adapt to changes in climate when they occur this quickly. We've seen large changes in the past over tens of millions of years. What we're asking living things to do now is to adapt to changes that are taking place a million times faster.
Dr. Mann, finally, I'd be derelict in my duty if I didn't ask you about ClimateGate, and you do address it head on in the book.
Sure.
Your use of the word containing relative, as I recall, to medieval warm periods that you were discussing in your work. Can you give us the Cliff's Note version of how you factored into ClimateGate?
Yeah, it's funny because when we look at all of these emails that were taken out of context, and they were
someone tapped into your email.
Yeah, these thousands of emails were stolen from a server in the UK, and it contained emails from many different climate scientists, including myself, and various lines, words and phrases were taken out of context and used to try to make it sound like scientists were fudging the data. And there have now been 7 or 8 different investigations, including one by the Inspector General of the National Science Foundation.
And one by the Parliament, right?
The UK, several in the UK, one by the UK Parliament, several by different science agencies in the US and various universities, and they've all found that there was no evidence at all of any impropriety. And I'll just take that one example where in that particular email I was actually using someone else's words. They weren't my own words. And what the person was simply saying, containing, meant that we only had estimates of temperature at the time that went back 1,000 years. And we were very interested in asking questions about, well, how warm was it 1,100 years or 1,200 or 1,300 years ago? Was there a medieval warm period a little further back that might have been as warm as what we see today? And so what we were talking about is, can we get enough data to go back far enough in time so that we entirely contain that interval of warmth, and we can really address the question of whether there was comparable warmth 1,000 years ago? And we now know, with some of these estimates extending now back in time nearly 2,000 years, that there wasn't. That period of time just didn't approach the warmth that we've seen in recent decades. And we also know now that anomalous warmth is due to human influences.
Senator Inhofe says you've perpetrated the single greatest hoax ever perpetrated upon the American people.
Yeah, well, as one colleague of mine said, scientists should be that organized. I mean, it's the idea that thousands of scientists, you get 3 scientists in a room, okay, and you're not going to agree on anything. I mean, that's what makes science so fascinating and so enjoyable, is that we're constantly engaged in a give and take of ideas. We're constantly subjecting each other to that give and take, to that good faith criticism, and that's what helps, it's that real skepticism that helps propel science forward. So the idea that thousands of scientists around the world could engage in a massive conspiracy and get the ice sheets and sea level rise to go along with it is a pretty remarkable claim.
Dr. Mann, I know what's going to happen. You're going to leave. I'll be overwhelmed with callers or email or tweets, and they'll say, well, you should have asked him this. So what I want to do is extend to you, sir, an invitation for a return engagement of the same duration, where I would facilitate and say, here are the questions that listeners wish I had asked you. If you'd be game for that, we'd set a mutually agreeable date. I'd promote the hockey stick and climate wars and be thrilled to welcome you back.
I would love to do that, Michael. And in fact, if your listeners want to engage with me in the meantime, I tweet at Michael E. Mann. Michael E. Mann at Twitter, and so I'd be happy to answer follow-up questions that way too.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Good luck on the book, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, Dr. Mann.
Thank you very much.
All right.